Here's what I know is true about you. You have questions. You have questions about God, about faith, and about the Bible. But here's the problem. Most churches aren't set up to address your questions. Let me be honest. For most of us, we go to church, we sit through a message on whatever topic the pastor thinks is interesting. But rarely do churches provide places and spaces for us to ask the questions that some of us have had on our hearts since we were little kids. But if we're honest, we've been too scared to ask those questions for fear of sounding, dumb, or sounding like we have these big, bad doubts. Well, friends, your questions deserve answers. So today, I'm launching a 5-session series on the top 5 questions people have asked me about faith. Those questions go like this. Number 1, why do bad things happen to good people? Number 2, what do we do about the violence in the Bible? Number 3, can I be a Christian and believe in evolution and science? Number 4, is it wrong to have doubts? And lastly, how can I follow a God who would let Christians do such bad things that they do in this world? These are our 5 questions. So, let's get started. Our first question is this: why do bad things happen to good people? Here's the truth. We've all had situations where people we love, they've been hurt and they just didn't deserve it. You've experienced this. There was that high school kid who died in a car accident. There was that grandfather who was giving his grandson a ride in his ATV on the frozen lake when the ice gave way. There was that sister who was diagnosed with breast cancer, that aunt who had a miscarriage, that friend who struggles with depression. And that's not to mention the many people who are innocent victims of things like war and poverty, famine. If God is really good and has a conscience, how can God allow such bad things to happen to really good people? Now, there's a fancy word for this question. This question is a question of theodicy. Now, what is theodicy? A theodicy is an attempt to explain the relationship between our human suffering and the nature of God. Since the beginning of time, people have tried to explain that relationship. For example, some would say that if God is good and there is all this bad in the world, well, then God must not exist at all. This is called atheism, and it's a version of theodicy. Others suggest that evil is a real force in the world, and our lives are sort of caught up in a cosmic battle between evil and good, sort of like Star Wars. Still others believe you get what you deserve in life based on your actions, and God is simply an observer. And others have said that God is a plan, and we don't understand that plan, but God is a plan, and our suffering is for our own good. These are some of the most popular theodicies. But I'd like you to consider another option. You see, there are others who believe that God actually allows suffering because he loves us so much. That suffering is an unfortunate byproduct of God's deep and abiding love for us. Now, bear with me, because I know this can sound a little sick and twisted if you don't listen carefully. Let me use a little analogy to explain. Not long ago, my 16-year-old son got his driver's license. Please pray for me and for him. Now, what I've realized in the last few months of him driving is that as a parent, I could say to him, you can only drive when I'm in the car. You can only drive when the roads aren't icy or wet. You can't drive at night. The conditions have to be perfect, and I must be in the car with you at all times. I could do that. And some parents choose to deal with their child's newfound freedom in that way. Or we could do something that takes way more trust. We could simply hand over the keys to our son. We could trust. We could choose to trust him. We could hand over the keys, knowing that handing over the keys is a whole lot more risky. He could drive too fast and hit a patch of ice. He could look down at his phone even though he knows he shouldn't. He could get into an accident that isn't his fault. You see, I think this is a great analogy for a healthy theodicy, a healthy understanding of our relationship to God. You see, God created this world and all that is in it. God created you and God created me. And then, get this, God handed us the keys. God looked at you and me and said, I love you so much that I'm going to choose to trust you, to give you the keys. God could have chosen to control things. God could have said, I'm going to predetermine every last moment of your days and keep you safe. God could have created us in such a way that we're simply sort of God's puppets. But is that really living? Like a parent who tries to control their child's every move. That's not loving. No, God gives us the keys. And in a world where God has absolute trust in us, God knows there are going to be hurts and pains. We're going to create blunders. We're going to trip. Like a parent trusting their son with the car, we're going to find ourselves in the ditch every now and then. But God trusts us. God trusts us with the keys. And I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want it any other way. So as we close today, I've got a couple of questions I want you to think about. The first question, it goes like this. What are some of the things you hear people say following tragedies that kind of have become cliche phrases, like everything happens for a reason, or it's all part of God's plan? And secondly, what do you think of this analogy for God? That out of love, God hands over the keys to you and me, and because of that, there is a level of risk in our lives. Gang, thanks for joining me today. I can't wait for our next session. We're going to wonder together, what do we do about the violence in the Bible?